Okay, so this week we are going to look at the mess that was taking place in the first century BC, and it primarily revolves around the actions of three people. We'll talk about a few more people, but in general, it revolves around Pompey, a man named Caesar, which I think is probably one of the more famous people in Roman history, and Octavius, who is probably the most important and well-known figure in Roman history, the first Roman emperor. Um, and what we're really looking at during this first century is the end of the Republic. So we've sort of been talking about that. And what we've seen is, as you look at the Roman historians who are writing, the Romans who are writing history, I should say, you will see that they primarily focus on the capture of all these large territories and then all the wealth that comes into the hands of a few, and what these few people do with all of this wealth. And according to Romans who are writing history, this leads to a decline of morals, and it leads to lots of other issues. So if they are true, and they probably are, a lot of this really comes out in the first century BC with the infighting between all of these people. And it really does bring the downfall of the Roman Republic and the introduction into the Roman Empire. Okay, let's talk a little bit about a man named Pompey. So if you remember, in the last lecture, we talked about Sulla, and we talked about Marius and all the issues that those two were having. This did not end. So what you see is that power, at least military power, was built up around the lines of these famous generals. So if you're a famous general and you did really well in battle, the men would sort of flock to you, and they would owe their allegiance to you instead of the Roman state or the Roman Senate. Now, what we find throughout the first century BC is that a number of these generals, like Pompey and Julius Caesar, were given armies by the Senate, and then they refused to give them up. So they refused to disband their armies. So the Senate had lots of issues with this, because usually what would happen, and this is the case in the first century BC, is those military men who have large armies tend to control what's happening. Now, Pompey was a pretty good general, as you can see from the slide here. Awarded a triumph, and we talked about those before. Those are the big military parades that are given when a general does something great. And this was given by Sulla. We find him in Spain. He was sent to Spain, raised a fairly large army, and he refused to disband this army when they wanted him to come back to Rome. And what he ended up doing is sort of pushing into southern France, and then the Senate ended up giving him military control back in Spain. And then ultimately he becomes a consul, which, if you remember, is one of the highest positions that you can get in the Roman government. And what's really interesting is that he was shared his consulship with a man named Crassus, who was also a very famous general. And the two really hated each other because they just fought back and forth. Now, Pompey is really famous for a number of different reasons. One is that he was given the job of clearing out the Mediterranean of pirates. Piracy was a pretty big deal throughout the Mediterranean. It really disrupted trade in a lot of different areas, because you have these unarmed ships essentially traveling, and then pirates know the sea routes, and they just intercept these ships and kill a bunch of people and take the wealth that's on the ship. So the Romans were getting tired of that. Now, they ended up giving the job to Pompey to clear out these pirates, and they gave him something called imperium, and we've talked about that before, where the consuls have power over pretty much anybody else to do what they want to within a certain time period. Now, according to some documents, Pompey was given a greater form of imperium, meaning when he encountered Roman officials in the east when he was sailing through the Mediterranean, technically there should be no one above him in terms of this imperium. So he's got a greater power than anybody else he would encounter, and he was essentially given free rein in terms of power, and it worked. According to our documents, Pompey was responsible for cleaning out the pirates in the Mediterranean, which of course meant more trade, more money coming in. He was also responsible for invading the east and going as far as making Syria a new province, which of course is sort of a continuation of the expansion of Roman power. And now they're really pushing up into what we call the Middle East and dealing with another great civilization there, the Parthians, who are in control of Persia. He ends up getting the title of Great, so sometimes you will see in the secondary literature and in the primary, Pompey the Great, and that's one of the reasons. I've already mentioned that he was an enemy of Crassus. These two did not get along even when they were joint consuls, and part of the reason for this is Crassus was really responsible for stopping the slave revolt of Spartacus. And I didn't really go into detail of this when we talked about the slave wars. I just mentioned that in the 70s, you've got the revolt of Spartacus, and then you have it put down. Well, it was really put down by Crassus. However, Crassus didn't like the fact that Pompey came out and really took responsibility for ending the wars that had started, especially in the East. And part of that winning the war also encompassed the claim that he was responsible for stopping the slave revolt of Spartacus. So Crassus was not very happy with that. Pompey also did a lot of things without the approval of the Senate. And, you know, as you can see, and we've already talked about this, the Senate was having difficulties in general, just controlling all of these people. So it's no big surprise that you would have this. You also have something called the Catiline conspiracy. This was done by a man named Catiline. And what Catiline ended up doing is he was trying to run for consul against Cicero. Now, Cicero was another very famous person from Roman history. He was a great orator. He ends up becoming a consul, which is kind of interesting because he has no military background. He pretty much got the spot because he was a great orator, a great speaker. He could convince a lot of people. And he also had very famous trials that he ends up winning and made a lot of news and so on. Now, Catiline, he, as I put here, rallied the poor and those who were enemies of Sulla. So if you remember, Sulla went through and did a big proscription, meaning he went after his enemies, and Catiline supported this. Now, Catiline ran for consul and he lost, and this really upset him. What he ended up doing is forming a conspiracy to kill the top people in the Roman government, including the two consuls who were consul at that period, Cicero and another man named Hybrida. Now, Cicero found out about this and suggested to the Senate that Catiline be killed along with all of his supporters. And this is exactly what the Senate ended up doing. They passed prescription against Catiline and his supporters. Catiline fled, but then was killed in battle. And then another very famous person gets involved in all of this, a man named Gaius Julius Caesar, better known to us as Caesar. Now, it's interesting, he was the nephew of Marius. So if you remember, Marius was against Sulla. So you've got Catiline, who is on the side of Sulla, and you've got Julius Caesar, who's the nephew of Marius. So this should have put the two at odds, and it didn't. I mean, Julius Caesar did not want Catiline put to death, but of course he really was. What you end up seeing for the first time in Roman history is something called a triumvirate. And let me see if I can get this little pen to write here. I think I've got the highlighter. But tri means three, and vir, V-I-R, means men, or man, really man, it's a singular. So three men, that's what a triumvirate is. And these three really took control of Rome. You've got Pompey, Crassus, and Caesar. And what they ended up doing is tying all of their family members together in terms of all of these marriages. None of them really liked each other, but this was the power that they decided to share. And you can see it's very different from the traditional form of having two consuls. So you've got things falling apart fairly rapidly after this. So Crassus is killed when he is fighting into Parthia. Now, Caesar is given a fairly large army and goes off into Gaul, which is really northern Europe. He's considered to be one of the most greatest generals in Roman history, and he wins a massive amount of territory in the far north. And of course, winning all of this really put the loyalty of his troops on him directly. And of course, he's getting lots of money. He ends up being an extremely wealthy person. What Pompey and Caesar ended up doing is trying to be joint consuls, or agreeing that, one would be consul at one time and one would be one at another. Now, this worked out well, but there was a law that said that the consuls actually have to make their case in front of people in Rome. Now, Caesar is off fighting in Gaul, and he wants to be consul. He does not want to come back into Rome because he knows that as he's fighting in Gaul, he has imperium. So there's a lot of things that protect him. If he puts down his arms and goes into Rome, he loses his imperium, and he could be in serious trouble by his enemies. And he certainly didn't want to do this. Now, Caesar was told to disband his entire army in Gaul, and he refused to do this as well. And then you get this very famous story about him crossing the river Rubicon in 49, and that the other very famous statement called "the die is cast," like he's crossed the river, whatever happens is going to happen. Caesar becomes the main dominant power when he defeated Pompey, and then Pompey ended up fleeing to Egypt, where he gets involved with the pharaoh that's there, and then they end up killing him after, probably at the asking of Caesar. Now, Caesar then went into Egypt and captured Egypt for Roman territory, and this is really when it becomes Roman territory. And this, of course, is where you get the famous introduction of Cleopatra, who was the last of the Ptolemies, the last of the family that stretched all the way back to Alexander the Great. Anyway, so the two of them apparently have an affair, and they have a son and so on. Caesar ended up fighting wars for the next 3 years, and I've given you the dates here, trying to clean up his, which is really a sole rule here. They did have joint consuls, but the other consul really had no power. He did a few things that really ended up causing his death. So I put up here, he made himself Dictator perpetuo, and you can see sort of perpetual in this Latin word, so dictator for life. Now, I want you to think back to the story of Tarquinius Superbus, the last king of Rome in 509 BC, and Brutus ends up, at least according to the story, helps to get rid of that last king and declares there will be no more kings in Roman government. So now you've got Caesar coming along, and dictators are not a new position. We've talked about that before. Dictator is usually installed when there are big military issues and it just takes one person. It's easier to have one person make the decision as opposed to two. But you don't have this idea of a dictator for life. Anyway, he becomes dictator of life. A lot of the senators were unhappy with this, but he held a massive army and he was extremely rich. He did not have an heir, so he ends up adopting his grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, as his son and as his heir. Now, it's Gaius Octavius who will become the first emperor in just a bit. And then you really have Caesar ruling Rome almost as a king. There's a story about Mark Antony, his general, trying to put a crown on Julius Caesar's head, and Julius Caesar says, no, I will not become a king. But it's really what he wanted, and the texts seem to imply that Julius Caesar was hoping that the people who were around him at that point would rally, like, yes, let's be a king. And it didn't happen, so he didn't take it there. No big surprise. So you've got Julius Caesar fighting in Gaul before this period. He made them citizens. He also increased the Senate again. So we talked about this with Sulla, who went from 300 people to 600. And now you've got Julius Caesar expanding the Senate to 900, sort of placing it full of people who were in support. And he also did a lot of good for Rome. I mean, he spent a lot of money on public works, out of his own money. And as I said, he was extremely rich. And doing things like this also helped him become ingrained with more of the poor people. So he was fairly famous. He ended up getting really a throne in the Senate. I don't know if you know this, but our month of July is named after Julius Caesar. So the Julius, his Julii family, settled the calendar of having 365 days. And, you know, no big surprise, he is very famous with the poor people. He's got a massive military made up of poor people. He gives away a lot of his money, makes Rome a lot better. The upper classes were not happy for various reasons. One, he's acting like a king, and it's a very different type of government than they really want. Now, I just mentioned the story of Brutus and Tarquinius Superbius. I want you to think back about that. Remember the rape of Lucretia and, you know, getting rid of a king. There is a man named Brutus who's also involved in the downfall of Julius Caesar. And the story goes is that Brutus, during the time of Julius Caesar, is related to the Bruti, the Brutus, who gets rid of the last king in 509 BC. So you've got the same family structure going down until you get this Brutus. And Brutus and a number of other senators conspired to kill Julius Caesar. And they did this on March 15th in 44 BC. And I don't know if you've heard of this, you know, beware of the Ides of March. So the Ides of March is the day that Julius Caesar was murdered, March 15th, supposedly, again, led by Brutus. So his rule is finished, and this led to sort of a ceasefire for a little bit between three people. Mark Antony, who again was a general of Julius Caesar, a man named Lepidus, and then you've got Octavius, who is now the heir of Julius Caesar. And of course, being the heir of Julius Caesar means he inherits that massive military and, more importantly, the massive amount of money that Julius Caesar had. Mark Antony, though, was against the idea of Octavius actually stepping into controlling Rome. So Mark Antony really wanted to take the place of Caesar because he was his general. They ended up making, as you can see down at the bottom, a second triumvirate. Now, before this, you've got Mark Antony and Octavius, who, again, as I note here, is only 19, fought in northern Italy and then marched back to Rome, and he wanted to be consul. Now, Octavius, again, was famous because of his adopted father. Octavius, we know, went around a large part of Italy and had people swear allegiance to him and no one else, which is kind of interesting. And this will come into play when you get the whole story that I'll tell you about in the next slide. So you've got everyone really starting to fight. You've got this proscription again, where they're killing the enemies, especially the enemies of Julius Caesar, because Octavius is really moving up in terms of his power. And then, of course, you've got the civil war between Mark Antony and Octavius. So they went to war. Antony went to Egypt, and he joined up Cleopatra. Now, I just told you that Julius Caesar and Cleopatra had an affair. They probably had a son together. According to the literature that we have, Antony and Cleopatra fell in love, and then Cleopatra, being the pharaoh of Egypt, had quite a bit of power. So Antony really wanted to use her power to overthrow Octavius and then, you know, take control of Rome again. So this is about the time point when Octavius went around and had everyone swear loyalty to him. And what he ended up doing is telling them, he said, look, if Mark Antony comes back into Rome, he's taking a foreign queen, Cleopatra, and she will be in charge of you. So whether that's true or not, that's what Octavius ended up doing, and it caused a lot of people to say, hey, we need to really stay with Octavius. And of course, he's passing around a whole bunch of money and so on. You have a very famous battle in 33 BC called the Battle of Actium. This was a naval battle, and it's where Octavius defeats Antony and Cleopatra. And then, of course, they flee to Egypt, and then you got the whole story about, you know, the two of them, what happened. What's more important for our purposes is that Octavius becomes the sole ruler in 27. We will talk about Octavius or Augustus or the first emperor in the next lecture, but what he ends up doing is technically declaring that he's giving all of his power back to the Senate and the people. And as I put here, it's not quite what really happened, but it really endeared him to a lot of people, and he was really the power behind everything until he really becomes the first emperor, and then he is the power behind